The solvent-soaked swab pressed against the canvas, swirling in a slow, hypnotic circle. Beneath the black crust of centuries, a blue eye dissolved into view. It was a masterpiece of mid-19th century technique, yet it possessed a disconcerting clarity. Elias Thorne, a man who made a living of the restoration of time's destruction, felt a faint prickle at the back of his neck. He chalked it up to the late hour and the fumes of the studio. He didn't notice the first change. 10 days into the project, Elias sat at his workbench, nursing a cup of coffee. He noticed a smudge of Prussian blue on the pad of his thumb and scrubbed at it with a rag soaked in mineral spirits, but the pigment seemed etched into his fingerprints. He frowned. He hadn't opened a tube of Prussian blue in months. He dismissed it as a phantom stain, a trick of the harsh studio lights on a tired mind. By the second week, the man in the painting was revealed to the jawline. The nobleman in the frame possessed a gaze that seemed to track Elias across the room. That Sunday, Elias woke with a peculiar stiffness in his right knee. When he walked to the kitchen, the joint gave a dry, hollow groan reminiscent of a great oak tree splintering in the wind. He made a mental note to see a doctor about bursitis and buy a bottle of linseed oil for his squeaky floorboards, never realizing the sound had come from his own marrow. Then came the scent. The studio began to smell of pine resin and dammer varnish, a sweet, cloying aroma that no amount of ventilation could clear. It seeped into his hair and eventually his breath. He tasted turpentine in his morning toast. He felt a constant, low-grade chill, as if the room's warmth was being drained toward the easel. On the 22nd night, everything came to a standstill. While restoring the painting, the mysterious warmth emanating from the easel caused him to feel a bead of sweat roll down his forehead. He reached up to wipe the wet trail from his brow, but his fingers slipped across his forehead as if moving over polished glass. He frowned and made his way to the wall-length mirror in the studio. His eyes widened as he took in his appearance. The skin of his forehead was no longer porous. It was a hard, eggshell-white surface, covered in a network of microscopic hairline fractures, the craquelure of an aging painting. He pressed his finger to a crack, expecting the feel of flesh. Instead, there was a sharp sound of a porcelain breaking. Elias stared at his reflection, convinced that the weeks of inhaling concentrated solvents had finally fractured his psyche. He watched the hairline fractures across his brow in the mirror and reasoned that this was a sensory breakdown, a vivid hallucination brought on by isolation and the chemical-heavy air of the studio. He turned back to the studio, planning to pack everything and go to bed earlier, already deciding to take a break for a couple of days. However, the portrait on the easel offered a terrifying counter-argument. Nobleman's black coat was now fully visible, and the painted chest was rising and falling in slow, heavy oscillations that synchronized perfectly with Elias' own faltering lungs. Every time the painted man exhaled, Elias felt his own ribs tighten, feeling less like bone and more like rigid laths of wood. Panic, cold and viscous as oil, finally set in. He lunged for a metal palette knife, his limbs snapping forward with the stilted, jerky momentum of a mechanical doll. He lunged at the easel, intent on shredding the painting, but the blade did not pierce it. Instead, it sank into the painted man's chest with a wet, fleshy thud, and a thick, black resin began to ooze from the puncture. Before he could pull the knife back, a hand emerged from the frame. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate extrusion of textured brushstrokes and hardened resin. It gripped Elias' wrist with the suffocating pressure of a drying vise. With the sound of a boot pulling out of thick clay, the man in the portrait began to peel himself away from the painting. Elias tried to bolt, but the studio was no longer a three-dimensional room. Corners of the ceiling were softening into charcoal sketches, and the shadows on the wall became static, cross-hatched ink lines. He reached for the door handle, but his fingers fused into a solid, unmoving block of flesh-colored wood, while his lips became tacky, sealed shut by a layer of half-dried glue. The entity stepped onto the floor with a jittery, frame-skipping gait and stood over Elias, reaching out to graze the man's cheek with a thumb that felt disturbingly like warm, living skin. Vibrant colors of Elias' tan skin and blue eyes were vacuumed away as it flowed like liquid light into the entity's dull form, leaving Elias behind as a dull, pencil-sketched ghost. In the heavy silence, the painted man hoisted the paper-thin body of the restorer and pressed him firmly into the swirling black canvas. The frame accepted him with a cold, magnetic snap, locking his limbs into a permanent, agonizing pose. The man adjusted his sleeves, which were now real fabric that held the scent of old lavender and dried blood. He stood before the mirror, watching as his clothes shivered and bled color, morphing into the shape of Elias' sweater, and watched his own jagged, painted teeth smoothen into white enamel. Behind him, the canvas suddenly curdled, and a thick, yellowed layer of artificial grime swept over the image of the trapped restorer, turning the vibrant scene into a dark, unidentifiable mess of old oil. The trap was reset. The man stepped out into the sun, ready to live the life Elias paid the price for.